What would you do if someone looked you in the eye and said, "You don't belong here"? Imagine boarding a midnight flight, dressed for business but carrying a lifetime of quiet battles. You're not a stranger to struggle. You're Isaiah Cole, a leader who spent his life breaking through ceilings no one else could see. But tonight, as the city lights fade beneath the wings of Orion Airways, a single moment threatens to unravel everything. A flight attendant's casual dismissal. A seat you've rightfully earned, suddenly out of reach. A silent cabin, watching, uncertain, as dignity is put on trial at 30,000 feet. Will one man's calm refusal to shrink spark real change, or will history repeat itself yet again? Why do some doors only open for certain faces? And how many times must you prove you belong before you're finally believed? If you think justice is just a word, wait until you see what happens when it has to land. Before we dive into this true-to-life journey, ask yourself, how far would you go to protect your dignity and the dignity of everyone who comes after you? If stories like this matter to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, get ready for the story that made the world stop and listen. "You don't belong here, sir. Coach is back there." Those were the exact words that cracked the air like a whip in cabin 1 of Orion Airways Flight OA709. The flight attendant, tall, poised, and sharp in a fitted Navy uniform, stood like a gatekeeper to a world that wasn't hers to guard. Passengers fell silent, utensils paused mid-air, a glass clinked too loudly. The plane hadn't even pushed back from Seattle Tacoma International yet, but in that moment, it felt like it stopped moving entirely. The man she was speaking to didn't flinch. He sat calmly in seat 1A. His long frame folded neatly into the plush leather. He wore a deep gray wool blazer over a crisp white shirt. No tie. His shoes were polished but modest. The only item that stood out was a well-traveled leather briefcase resting gently beneath his feet. Weathered, trusted, like him. His name was Isaiah Cole. Mid-40s, clean-shaven with salt and pepper stubble around the jaw. Skin rich and deep brown, composed, quiet, intentional. And that was the problem, at least to her. She stood above him with a kind of authority that didn't come from rank, but from assumption. Her name tag read, Vanessa Crane, lead purser. She held a clipboard like it was a badge. Isaiah looked up at her slowly, eyes calm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't bristle. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a folded boarding pass, and handed it to her. Seat 1A, Business Elite. Verified. She barely glanced at it. Then she glanced at him, and glanced again. Then she frowned. "This seat was reassigned this morning," she said. "There must be a mix-up. I confirmed it at the gate," Isaiah said evenly. "The barcode scanned without issue. It's printed right there." Vanessa pursed her lips and gave the pass another look. But she wasn't reading anymore. She was watching him. Measuring something she couldn't quite name but didn't like the feeling of. Then she did something that made Isaiah's stomach turn not out of surprise, but recognition. She pointed to the back of the plane. "Until we can sort this out. I'll need you to wait in economy. No apology, no clarification, no hint of diplomacy. Just an instruction cloaked in manufactured politeness." She was already turning to signal another flight attendant when Isaiah spoke again. Why Vanessa froze. "What's wrong with my boarding pass?" he asked. Her eyes darted for a split second. Then she said it. "You don't look like you belong in this seat, sir." Isaiah didn't blink. He didn't clench his fists. But something changed. Not on his face. In the room. The air pulled tighter around them. One sentence had shifted the atmosphere of the cabin. Again, he could hear his own heartbeat. But this wasn't the first time he'd been told he didn't belong. Not in those exact words, but close enough, in tone, in posture, in silence. He was familiar with that sentence, even when it showed up dressed differently. He'd heard it as a child. He'd heard it in college. He'd heard it in boardrooms, where he sat across from executives who smiled tightly and said, "We'll be in touch," before calling someone else. He'd heard it in 1,000 different languages, but it never stopped stinging. In the seat beside him, a middle-aged woman with shoulder-length red hair and a notepad in her lap. Her name was Helena Moore. Though Isaiah didn't know that yet, looked up sharply. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't say anything, not yet, but her eyes narrowed as she watched. Vanessa gestured again, this time to a young male flight attendant standing a few steps behind her. "Carter, could you please assist this gentleman to economy until we can sort this Carter Blake, maybe mid-30s, puffed his chest slightly as he stepped forward, confident, eager, but unsure why. He reached down toward Isaiah's briefcase. "I'll carry my own bag," Isaiah said. The voice was low, polite, firm. Carter froze mid-motion. "Look, man, we're just doing our job. Don't make this into something it's not." Isaiah stood. "I'm not," he replied. "But you already did." It wasn't loud, but it carried, all the way to row 5, and probably to the jump seats behind the curtain. As Isaiah stepped into the aisle, the silence grew thicker. The hum of air vents, the rustle of newspapers, the clink of an ice cube, all louder now. Passengers looked away. Phones weren't recording yet, but eyes were. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. Not from the day, from the wait. As he walked past the curtain separating first class from economy, something inside him stirred. Not rage, not revenge. Memory. He was 15 again, standing outside a classroom on the south side of Chicago, shivering in a hoodie with a hole in the sleeve. Kicked out for violating the school dress code. He hadn't cursed. He hadn't been late. He just didn't look the part. That's what his teacher had said. Isaiah never forgot that day. And now, nearly 3 decades later, he was being told again. Only this time, the sweater had been replaced by a tailored jacket, and the schoolroom by an airplane. And yet the message hadn't changed. Behind him, Vanessa turned away, already on to the next task. Carter followed close behind. Helena watched them go, lips tight. Back in economy. Isaiah settled into seat 23F without a word. He adjusted his briefcase under the seat and sat upright. Around him, passengers whispered. Some stared. Others just felt the shift without knowing why. The flight hadn't left the ground yet, but something else already had. And it wouldn't land until truth did. Orion Airways flight OA 709 was scheduled to depart from Seattle-Tacoma International Airport at 6:05 p.m., en route to Lisbon. A 10-hour flight. Overnight. Long enough for most people to relax, sleep, and arrive in another time zone, forgetting what happened in between. But not tonight. Not on this flight. Isaiah Cole sat in seat 23F, his briefcase tucked neatly beneath him, arms folded lightly in his lap. His expression was neutral, maybe even unreadable to the untrained eye. But his mind was moving, quickly, observing, measuring, not just the crew's behavior, but every detail, the body language of surrounding passengers, the tone of the announcements, the weight of silence after conflict. This wasn't just another flight. It was a quiet inspection. A few weeks before this night, Isaiah had been sitting in a glass-walled boardroom 26 floors above Manhattan, reading an internal report. It was one of several, but this one sat heavy in his chest. The language was clean, formal, but the message wasn't hard to translate. Increasing number of discrimination-related complaints on premium routes, predominantly filed by passengers of color, trendline rising, incidents occurring most frequently on overnight international flights, first class, business elite. The report didn't name names, but Isaiah saw a pattern, and instead of launching a press statement or scheduling a DEI training week, he'd quietly reserved a flight himself. No company tag, no email announcement, just a booking made under his middle name, and a plan to observe. He hadn't come to be noticed. He came to see who noticed him. Now he sat in the economy section of his own airline, removed from a first-class seat he paid for and more than that, one assigned to him under an internal executive code. His name was in the system. His title didn't matter, but the seat should have. And yet, somehow, it didn't. He watched a young couple trying to soothe a crying baby 2 rows ahead. The mother looked exhausted, rocking in rhythm with the hum of the engines. The father apologized under his breath to no one in particular. Isaiah didn't judge them. If anything, the familiarity of struggle grounded him. He remembered when his daughter was that small, when he and Mariah still shared morning routines. She'd hand him the baby, half asleep, and whisper, "Take this shift. I'll love you forever." He smiled faintly at the thought. Then it faded. That was another time, another version of him, and yet somehow connected to this one. He shifted in his seat and checked the time. It had been less than 10 minutes since the incident in first class, but it felt like an hour. Up front, beyond the heavy curtain, Vanessa Crane moved briskly through the cabin like nothing had happened. Professional posture, controlled voice, as if her actions hadn't just created a ripple effect that would travel further than she could imagine. But not everyone had moved on. In seat 1B, Helena Moore sat motionless, pen in hand, her notebook still resting on her thigh. She had written down only 2 words since the incident boarding pass. Her eyes flicked between her page and the empty seat next to her. She didn't know Isaiah's name yet, but she knew what she saw. She had seen Vanessa's face shift when she first looked at him, had seen her body tense, had seen her ignore the boarding pass, twice. She had watched enough courtrooms and sat through enough city council meetings to know the moment when someone made a decision before pretending to ask a question. That's what had happened here. This wasn't about policy. It was about permission. In seat 3C, another man sat in subtle silence. Calvin Rhodes, late 30s, black, short, clean-cut beard. Eyes sharp, but casual enough to blend in. Calvin wasn't a stranger to these flights. He worked in strategic partnerships and traveled internationally every other week. Tonight, he wasn't working, not officially, but when Isaiah had been approached by Vanessa, Calvin had turned on his phone's voice memo, and when Carter tried to take the briefcase, he had tapped the record button, just in case. He hadn't shared the files yet. He hadn't uploaded anything. He was waiting, because what he saw wasn't just bad optics. It was a breach. And if Isaiah was who Calvin suspected he was, this flight was no longer heading to Lisbon. It was heading toward an audit, a quiet, sharp one. Farther forward in the cabin, Olivia Tran sat near the front service station. She was the senior flight attendant on tonight's roster, though technically outranked by Vanessa's purser role. Olivia had seen Isaiah board early, had noted his name on the manifest. Isaiah Cole. She remembered thinking it was familiar. Now, as she opened the tablet again and checked the internal manifest codes, her heart dropped. Seat 1A. Confirmed. Internal status VIP. Code level executive. She blinked, then tapped twice to confirm. Still there. Not reassigned. No update. No error message. Just a single name. In the right seat. Olivia felt her breath catch as the realization settled. He didn't just belong there. He owned it. She printed the passenger manifest, her hands shaking slightly. Then she stood, smoothed her uniform, and walked quietly toward Vanessa. Vanessa was preparing the pre-flight service items at the front galley, eyes scanning a checklist. "Vanessa," Olivia said softly, "I rechecked the manifest. The gentleman you moved from 1A. That seat wasn't reassigned." Vanessa didn't look up. "He already moved. Let's not make this a thing." "But it's still his seat," Olivia said. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. Her voice dropped just a tone. "We're behind schedule. We can deal with this after takeoff." Olivia didn't respond. She just stood there, then said quietly, "It already is a thing." Carter Blake, who had overheard the conversation from near the beverage cart, let out a quiet scoff. "You know how they get," he muttered. Olivia turned to him, blinking slowly. "Who exactly is they?" "Carter." He raised both hands halfway in surrender. "You know what I mean." But Olivia did know. She knew exactly what he meant. And she knew this wasn't about a boarding pass anymore. It was about who gets believed, who gets dismissed, who gets erased. And who, if the flight kept going this way, was about to make the biggest mistake of their career. From her place at the front galley, Vanessa Crane looked out over the cabin like it was a stage. She scanned row after row, ticking through her mental checklist: drinks, head count, tray carts, time zones. But one thing kept tugging at her thoughts, breaking her rhythm like a skip beat in a well-practiced song. It wasn't the seating manifest. It wasn't even the delayed boarding. It was him, the man she had asked to move. He hadn't argued, hadn't resisted. He had looked her in the eye and calmly walked away, as if he were used to being removed from places other people assumed he didn't belong. That part unsettled her more than anything, because she had seen something in his eyes, not fear, not defiance, but recognition. Like this wasn't new, like he had expected it and accepted it, and she didn't know what to do with that. Vanessa had worked flights for 16 years. She knew how to deal with angry passengers, entitled businessmen, overbooked seats, malfunctioning screens, but quiet dignity unnerved her more than any outburst ever could. It held up a mirror, and she didn't always like what she saw. She glanced down at her clipboard again. "Seat 1A, empty now. The man Isaiah." She thought his name was taking it without hesitation, confident, not cocky. She hadn't felt threatened, not physically, but something in her reflex told her to question him. Why she blinked hard, annoyed at herself for even asking the question. It was protocol, she told herself. When in doubt, verify. Keep the cabin controlled. Prevent confusion. Still, the image of his boarding pass burned into her mind. She had seen it, twice, so why hadn't she believed it, behind her? Olivia Tran stood quietly with a printed manifest in her hand. She hadn't said anything since their brief exchange. But Vanessa felt her presence like static in the air. She knew Olivia disagreed, knew she was watching. That made it worse. She took a breath, hoping the next hour would smooth itself out, hoping the captain would make the final call to push back from the gate. But that moment was still hanging. And upstairs, somewhere in the flight deck, someone else had just been given the same printed manifest. Captain Marcus Langley adjusted his headset and read over the document again. this time slower. He had been on hundreds of flights, handled emergencies, mechanical failures, even onboard medical crises. But this was different. The paper in front of him made it clear. Seat 1A, Isaiah Cole. Status Internal Executive Authorization Code, OAVPNA. Langley blinked. OA stood for Orion Airways. VP was Vice President level. NA North America. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. The man sitting in economy. He wasn't just a passenger. He was a top-tier officer within the airline's regional command. Not only that, he had boarded silently, without a badge, without special treatment. That wasn't just humility. That was intentional. The captain reached for the intercom switch, hesitated, then clicked it off. He turned to his first officer and said quietly, "I'll be right back." Meanwhile, in seat 23F, Isaiah sat still. He wasn't scrolling his phone. He wasn't reviewing emails. He just sat with his hands folded, gaze fixed somewhere in the middle distance. He didn't need a screen to replay what happened. The echo of Vanessa's words lingered in his chest, like a bruise forming slowly under the skin. "You don't look like you belong in this seat, sir." He had heard worse, but somehow this one slid deeper. Not because it was loud, but because it was casual. Worn in, like she'd said it before. In other ways, to other people. He felt the same quiet weight that had followed him since his early 20s. Back then, he'd interviewed for an internship at a major airline, the same company that would eventually hire him years later, after a long, crooked path of patience. He remembered walking into that interview in a borrowed suit, shoes polished with hand soap, resume printed on his last clean sheet of paper. He'd nailed every question. Or so he thought, until the hiring manager smiled, leaned back, and said the words he'd never forget. "You're impressive, Isaiah, but we're looking for someone with a more presentable image." He didn't ask what that meant. He didn't need to. He had walked out of that building knowing something vital, that sometimes it didn't matter how qualified you were. It mattered how comfortable you made other people feel, and comfort, in their world, rarely looked like him. Now, nearly 2 decades later, it still didn't. The soft click of polished shoes approached. He looked up. It was the captain. Marcus Langley paused by Isaiah's seat, kneeling slightly to meet his eye level. His voice was quiet, respectful. "Mr. Cole," he said, "I believe we've made a serious mistake." Isaiah didn't move. "I came back here to apologize directly." The captain continued, "Your seat 1A was not reassigned. Your pass is valid, and the code tied to your name. It confirms your position." He offered the manifest. Isaiah took it gently, scanned it without emotion, then folded it once and held it in his hand. There was no glitch. Isaiah said. Langley nodded. "No, sir. There wasn't. I'd like to return to my seat now." "Of course," the captain said. "Please follow me." The aisle stretched out before him like a runway, and as Isaiah stood, every head within earshot turned. The quiet man from economy was walking back to first class, and something was about to change. Isaiah followed Captain Langley down the aisle, his steps even, his gaze steady. He didn't rush. He didn't swagger. He simply moved forward, one quiet step at a time. Passengers turned as he passed. Some tried not to stare. Others didn't bother to hide it. One man shifted in his seat, then looked down at his hands as if they were suddenly interesting. A teenage girl whispered something to her mother, who whispered something back that didn't sound like comfort. And at the front of the aircraft, Vanessa Crane stood frozen. She heard the captain's footsteps before she saw them, heard the hush fall over the first-class cabin, heard her own breath catch. When Isaiah reappeared through the curtain, she instinctively took half a step back. It wasn't fear, it was exposure. She saw the manifest still in his hand, folded, clean, official, behind her. Carter Blake stood near the service station, arms loosely crossed but his fingers twitching. His jaw tightened when he saw Isaiah. Captain Langley stopped just beside Vanessa and gestured toward seat 1A. "Mr. Cole," he said simply. "Welcome back." Isaiah nodded once and returned to the seat that had never stopped being his. He didn't even glance at Vanessa. Not at first. He placed his briefcase back under the seat, then slowly sat down. He adjusted his cuffs, rolled his shoulders back, settled in with the quiet presence of someone who had carried this kind of weight before. Then, finally, he looked up. Vanessa was still there, her hands now clasped awkwardly in front of her. "We sincerely apologize, Mr. Cole," she said. "There must have been a system glitch." Isaiah stared at her for a long moment. Not angry, not cold, just exact. "It wasn't a glitch," he said. "It was a decision." Her mouth opened, then closed. "I had to act quickly," she offered. "You weren't clearly responding to our questions." I responded clearly. Twice. The captain stood by, silent now, letting the weight of those words do their work. Carter shifted again, muttering, "This is getting blown out of proportion." Isaiah turned slightly toward him. "You don't get to decide that," he said. Carter's jaw moved, but no sound came out. Helena Moore, still seated in 1B, uncrossed her arms. She leaned forward slightly and said, "He was here before I even boarded. I saw it. You never questioned anyone else's boarding pass." Vanessa looked at Helena, her lips pulling into a polite mask. "This isn't your concern," she said tightly. "It is now," Helena replied, "because we all saw what you did, and we're not going to pretend it didn't happen." Across the aisle, Olivia Tran returned from the galley. She looked more composed now, steadier. She stepped up beside Vanessa and quietly held out the printed manifest. "I showed her this," Olivia said, voice calm but firm, "before pushback. She told me not to interfere." Isaiah turned to Olivia. "Thank you," he said. Olivia met his gaze with a nod. There was no triumph in her face, only clarity, relief, and something else, regret. Captain Langley finally spoke. "We're not pushing back yet," he said. "I'm making a formal report to corporate before this aircraft leaves the ground. Mr. Cole's seat was never in question. What happened here will be addressed." Carter scoffed quietly and muttered under his breath, "People are so sensitive these days." Isaiah stood. The entire cabin seemed to exhale in anticipation. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. He just spoke. "This was never about a boarding pass," he said. "It was about a judgment call made the moment someone looked at me." Vanessa flinched. "You saw my face and assumed it didn't belong next to this seat number. And worse, you assumed no one would notice. That I'd stay quiet." He glanced around the cabin. Some passengers looked away. Others met his gaze. A few nodded slowly. Helena whispered, "Damn right." Isaiah looked back to Vanessa. "I didn't come on this flight to make a point. I came to do my job. But the moment you made your decision, you gave me another one." Vanessa looked down, unable to meet his eyes. Behind her, Carter shifted like he wanted to disappear into the bulkhead. Isaiah sat again, his body calm, but his presence taking up more space than before. And for the first time since boarding, everyone knew exactly who he was. He was not just a man who bought a seat in first class. He was a man who had earned the power to hold people accountable for how they treated others in that seat. The aircraft was still on the tarmac. Engines idle, lights steady. But something in the air had shifted, no longer thick with assumption, now charged with consequence, and it was only the beginning. For a moment, everything in the first-class cabin held its breath. Isaiah Cole sat again in seat 1A, shoulders back, hands resting lightly on his thighs, gaze out the window. He didn't need to speak anymore. The silence around him said more than any words could. Vanessa Crane moved to the side of the galley, her face stiff. The tidy line of her posture had begun to unravel. Her shoulders dipped. Her fingers played nervously with the silver pen clipped to her apron. Across the aisle, Helena Moore reached for her notebook again. She had covered City Hall protests, school board walkouts, wrongful arrest cases. But this was something quieter, and in many ways, louder. The kind of moment people might try to forget, but shouldn't. She wrote 4 words in bold script across the top of her page. He never raised his voice. A few rows behind, in business class. Calvin Rhodes adjusted the brightness on his phone. His thumb hovered over the voice recording. The file was saved. He wasn't sending it yet. Not because he was scared, because he was waiting. He had seen Isaiah Cole speak at a conference 2 years ago. Calm, sharp, full of perspective. Back then, Isaiah had delivered a keynote titled The Hidden Work of Belonging. Calvin remembered sitting in the 3rd row thinking, this man gets it. And now, here he was, a silent subject in a story Calvin wasn't sure how to write. At the rear edge of the first-class curtain, Olivia Tran stood just out of view. She wasn't hiding. She was watching, listening. Her fingers curled around the manifest she had printed earlier. The paper was creased now, folded once from Isaiah's grip, but still legible. She wanted to speak again, but she also knew the flight was at a tipping point. Sometimes silence was cowardice, but other times it was preparation. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Meanwhile, the man who had caused the most noise earlier finally stirred. Carter Blake stood at the galley divider, arms still folded across his chest, but now with tension threading through every joint. He kept glancing toward Vanessa, hoping she'd do something, say something. Instead, she looked smaller now, not because anyone had taken her power, but because she had misused it and been seen. Passengers in rows 1 through 4 were whispering now, not just in curiosity, in conscience. Did he say anything to her? I saw him show the pass twice. Why didn't she check the system first? One passenger, a balding man in 2D, whispered to his wife, I think that guy's somebody. The captain came for him himself. His wife replied, even if he's not. They were wrong. No one was recording. Not yet. But eyes were open, and so were ears. Isaiah remained still. He wasn't savoring anything. He wasn't waiting for apologies. He was simply observing. Because the truth is, leadership isn't always loud. Sometimes, it just sits back in its seat and lets people look at themselves in the reflection of their own silence. Captain Langley returned from the flight deck, a tablet in hand, his expression unreadable. He stepped into the galley, exchanged a glance with Olivia, then looked to Vanessa. We're pausing departure, he said plainly. Vanessa blinked. Captain, we can't delay much longer. International Window Langley raised a hand gently. I've spoken to corporate. There's an open escalation notice tied to this flight now. We're not moving until I complete the personnel incident report. You're both named. Her face went pale. Carter leaned forward. Both Langley nodded. You forcibly displaced a verified executive from his assigned seat, without cause, without verification, and then you disregarded a second officer's attempt to clarify it. That's not a judgment call. That's a liability. Carter took a step back, color draining from his face. Vanessa tried to regain control. I didn't mean to insult anyone. I was just protecting the cabin environment. We have procedures for that. Langley looked at Isaiah, then back at her. Respect isn't a procedure. It's a baseline. From her seat, Helena spoke again. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried. Can I ask something? Langley turned toward her. Go ahead. Had he been a white man in a business suit, same seat, same pass, would this have happened? The silence that followed was longer than necessary. Vanessa said nothing. Carter looked away. Langley didn't answer. He didn't need to. Helena turned to Isaiah. Thank you for holding your seat the way you did. You gave people a chance to do the right thing, even when they didn't. Isaiah's eyes met hers. He nodded. Once. Olivia stepped forward then. She looked directly at Langley. Captain, I'd like to go on record. I attempted to intervene and was told to stand down. Langley nodded. It's noted. Carter opened his mouth again. Come on. He didn't even say who he was. How were we supposed to know Isaiah finally spoke? You weren't supposed to know. Carter frowned. Isaiah continued. You weren't supposed to treat me differently because I have power. You were supposed to treat me right because I'm a person. Every head nearby turned toward him. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He was clear. Vanessa stepped back into the galley. Her hands were trembling now. She tried to hide it, but Olivia saw. And for a moment, she felt pity. But it wasn't enough to stop her from speaking again. Captain, I think we need to consider a temporary crew reassignment before we leave the ground. Langley looked at her. You're not wrong. He turned to his comms device and called for a gate supervisor. Down in the terminal, someone's headset buzzed. Back on the plane, something had changed. Passengers leaned back in their seats, eyes wide, thoughts heavy. For the first time since the boarding doors closed, the aircraft felt still, not quiet. Still, because justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it just waits for someone to do what's right before the wheels ever leave the ground. Isaiah Cole sat in seat 1A once more, hands resting lightly on the armrest, his body still, but his mind churning. Around him, the cabin had gone still, but not silent. There were whispers now, the low kind, like people trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed without looking like they were a part of it. But Isaiah didn't hear any of them. He was too deep inside the memory that had just been triggered, one he had buried years ago, or thought he had. He had been 23, fresh out of Howard University, degree in operations and logistics, a job interview with a global airline, not Orion, one of its predecessors. He had walked into the room full of optimism, his best suit pressed the night before with a hotel iron, shoes buffed, resume double-checked. He had spent the whole night practicing how to make eye contact, how to sit tall, how to answer the inevitable question about team culture fit. The man who interviewed him looked like he had been doing the job too long. Gray hair, gray suit, gray smile. He skimmed the resume, then looked up. Impressive background. The man had said, sharp, confident. I don't know if you're quite what passengers expect to see in charge. Isaiah remembered freezing, not from surprise, but from how familiar it already felt. He didn't ask for clarity. He didn't push back. He shook the man's hand, smiled politely, and left. 3 months later, he was hired by a smaller carrier. 6 years after that, he moved into regional management. Now, nearly 2 decades later, he sat on a plane that he helped fund, helped restructure, helped brand, and still, someone looked at him and saw someone out of place. Isaiah blinked slowly, returned to the present, across the aisle. Helena Moore continued scribbling notes, eyes steady, jaw set. She had seen enough. She wasn't just documenting this as a journalist anymore. She was invested. 3 rows back, Calvin Rhodes tapped out a quiet message on his phone to a friend at Orion's corporate PR team. Flight OA709. We might have a situation brewing. Exec-level passenger wrongly removed from first class. Sensitive optics. Do not let this go unchecked. The reply came seconds later. Name Calvin, typed Isaiah Cole. There was a pause. Then another message appeared. Understood. Internal alert already triggered. Meanwhile, Olivia Tran stood just beyond the curtain near the service station. Her palms were still slightly damp, her mouth dry. She'd been through conflict before fussy passengers, weather delays, onboard medical calls. But this felt different. This was moral. This was about more than comfort or compliance. It was about character. She looked toward Vanessa, who had retreated halfway into the galley, whispering something to Carter. Carter didn't look like he was taking it well. He kept shaking his head, pointing subtly toward Isaiah. You're acting like he's royalty or something, Carter hissed. He's not, Olivia said calmly. Stepping in. He's just someone we treated unfairly. He didn't even say who he was. He didn't have to. Carter's voice rose a little too loudly. We're supposed to check suspicious things. He looked, I don't know, off. Olivia narrowed her eyes. Off. How Carter hesitated. You know what I mean? No, she said, voice sharper now. I want you to say it. What did he look like that made you think he didn't belong? Carter glanced around, suddenly aware that the curtain didn't block sound as well as he thought. From his seat, Isaiah heard it, all of it. And a familiar ache returned, that tight knot under the sternum. Not anger, not pain, but exhaustion, because that was always the excuse. You know what I mean. He sat back, closed his eyes for a moment, and heard another voice echo through time. His mother's. Isaiah. If they ever make you feel small, don't shrink. Just stand. She had said that the night he was passed over for a youth leadership award at church. Said it again when he didn't make captain on the school debate team, even though he led in scores. And one last time when he called her from a layover in Atlanta and told her someone at a client dinner asked if he was with catering. She passed the year he made VP. He never got to tell her. But her voice lived in moments like this. The quiet fire. The center of him. Captain Langley reappeared in the first-class cabin, then. He wasn't holding a tablet or clipboard this time. Just himself. Authority and posture, not props. He cleared his throat lightly, then looked at Isaiah. Sir, he said, I've just spoken with operations management. There's consensus on action. Vanessa and Carter turned toward him in unison. Langley didn't look at them. I'll be calling for replacement crew. Temporarily. To ensure this flight proceeds with full passenger confidence and procedural alignment. Vanessa stepped forward. Captain. I. Langley held up a hand. Ms. Crane. This isn't personal, but your decision created risk, not just for Orion, for every person watching. She bit her lip. Carter muttered something under his breath again. No one responded. Isaiah finally spoke. I appreciate the professionalism, Captain. Langley gave a small nod. I'd like to have a short word with you in the galley, Isaiah added. Langley looked surprised, but nodded. Of course. They both stood and stepped into the front galley, the curtain drawn behind them. The hum of refrigeration units was soft, the space tight, but private enough. Langley waited. Isaiah didn't raise his voice. I didn't come on this flight to create headlines, he said. I booked it quietly, under a secondary name, no flags, no status ping. Langley nodded. I was conducting an internal review. We've had a rise in complaints tied to how passengers of color are treated in premium cabins. This flight was a test. I hoped it would be uneventful. Langley exhaled through his nose. It almost was, he said. Isaiah shook his head. No, it never was. The moment I walked in, the test had already begun. I just hadn't said anything yet. Langley didn't speak. He just listened. Isaiah pulled a plain white envelope from his inner coat pocket. He handed it to Langley. Inside is a memo. Operational restructure draft. New training program. New reporting channels. It was supposed to roll out next quarter. But now, Langley took the envelope. Now, it has a face, Isaiah said. Mine. He stepped out of the galley, back into the cabin. And for the first time, every eye wasn't just looking at him. They were listening. When Isaiah stepped back through the curtain and into the cabin, there was no applause, no announcement, just presence, his, and what it carried. He walked slowly, his frame steady, his eyes forward. The moment he reappeared, conversation stopped. Forks paused. Eyes flicked up, then down, then back again. He wasn't a spectacle. He was a reckoning. He returned to seat 1A, gently adjusted the briefcase under his feet, and sat like he had before. Calm, rooted. Not a man who had won a battle, but a man who had shown people there was a war they pretended didn't exist. Across the aisle, Helena Moore felt her throat tighten. She had covered her share of stories about injustice, but this wasn't a breaking news headline. It was quiet erosion, the kind that steals opportunity slowly over time. And today, for once, someone caught it in the act. She looked at Isaiah as he settled into his seat and thought, he's not just sitting back down, he's standing for something. In the row behind, a businessman who had remained silent through the earlier tension shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had heard everything, had watched as it unfolded. But when it was time to speak up, he hadn't. Now he couldn't stop hearing Isaiah's words. You weren't supposed to treat me differently because I have power. You were supposed to treat me right because I'm a person. The man turned to his wife and whispered, We should have said something. His wife nodded slowly. Next time, she whispered back. But Isaiah wasn't waiting on anyone's guilt. He had work to do. From the galley, Captain Marcus Langley returned to his seat at the front of the plane, but not before checking in with the replacement crew that had just arrived. 2 new attendants, quiet and composed, entered the cabin with subtle efficiency, nodding respectfully as they passed Isaiah. Vanessa Crane and Carter Blake stood by the exit door, their bags in hand. The expression on Vanessa's face had changed. Less indignation, more disbelief. Carter's face was stiff, pale. Neither of them spoke. No one asked them to. They stepped through the open door and off the aircraft. No send-off, no ceremony, just the sound of boots over jet bridge carpet. Justice didn't always come with thunder. Sometimes it left quietly through Gate 9B. Olivia Tran remained at the front, assisting the new crew with assignments. Her voice was calm, measured. She didn't look triumphant. She looked focused. She met Isaiah's eyes as she passed, and he gave her a small nod. It was enough. Back in 1B, Helena scribbled another line into her notebook. He didn't need a badge to lead, just integrity. Passengers had returned to their seats, but no one had returned to pretending. Something about the atmosphere felt different now, like the air had been cleared of something invisible but toxic. From 3 rows back, Calvin Rhodes sent a final secure message to his PR contact. It's been handled, but not quietly. He didn't escalate. He revealed, passenger still calm, but people know now. They're watching. In the main cabin. Flight attendants began preparing for service again. Carts were moved. Overhead bins double-checked. But the usual pre-departure chatter hadn't returned. People weren't looking at their phones. They were looking inward. Isaiah sat in 1A, eyes closed briefly, breathing through the moment. Then he felt something soft placed on the armrest beside him. A folded napkin. He opened his eyes. Helena had written in clean cursive, "Thank you for not backing down. You gave us all permission to speak next time." He nodded gently and tucked the note into his briefcase. Captain Langley made one final pass through the aisle, stopping briefly at Isaiah's seat. "Cabin is clear. Doors are secure. Pushback approved." Isaiah gave a simple nod. Langley hesitated for a second, then leaned in slightly. "Mr. Cole, I just want to say, I'm sorry this happened. I wish we'd known who you were when you boarded." Isaiah looked up, his voice low but firm. "That's the problem," he said. "You shouldn't have to know who I am to treat me like I matter." Langley nodded once and quietly returned to the cockpit. The plane finally began to move, tires rolling slowly on the tarmac, engines humming in low rhythm. Overhead bins clicked into place, seat belts fastened, but even as the aircraft moved toward the runway, no one forgot what had taken place at the gate. It had nothing to do with turbulence, and everything to do with who was allowed to fly smoothly in the first place. Helena looked out the window and whispered to herself, "This is the kind of story people pretend doesn't happen anymore." She turned back toward Isaiah. "Except today, it did. And it wasn't buried. Not this time." The wheels lifted off the runway with a soft rumble, the nose of the aircraft rising into the fading sky over Seattle. Seatbelt signs glowed above the aisles. Overhead lights dimmed. Outside the window, the skyline blurred into clouds. Inside the cabin, everything was quiet. Isaiah Cole leaned his head back gently, eyes open but unfocused. The hum of the engine wasn't loud, but it filled the space like a low reminder that movement was happening, that something had taken off. Not just the plane, the truth. And yet, with all that had unfolded in the last hour, his chest felt heavy, not with anger, not even with relief, with memory. He thought about the moment Vanessa told him he didn't belong in his seat, the way her voice hadn't wavered, the way her tone had sounded rehearsed, like she had practiced that kind of exclusion in small, daily ways. But what cut deeper wasn't the words. It was how unsurprised he felt hearing them. That part stayed with him. It always had. He remembered sitting in his car outside a hotel in Minneapolis years ago, just after his promotion to regional director. He had just finished a long week of restructuring meetings, late-night calls, airport delays. all of it aimed at building a more equitable internal framework. But when he arrived at the hotel and tried to check in, the man at the front desk had barely looked at his ID. "I'm sorry, sir. We don't have you in the system. Are you sure you're in the right location?" Isaiah had shown his confirmation number twice. It wasn't until a junior associate walked in behind him, white, 20-something, dressed in jeans and a hoodie, and greeted Isaiah by name, that the front desk clerk suddenly found the reservation. Isaiah hadn't said a word, just accepted the key, nodded politely, and walked to the elevator. Later that night, he sat on the bed and thought, "How many times do I have to earn the right to just be seen?" He had lost count. Now, flying over the Pacific Northwest, that same ache stirred again. Except this time, he had said something. Not loudly, not with fists or shouting, but with presence, with calm, with clarity. And that, perhaps, was what disturbed people the most. Not his anger, his composure. Across the aisle. Helena Moore had stopped writing. Her notepad sat in her lap, her pen resting on the edge of the tray table. She glanced at Isaiah occasionally, but more than that, she observed the ripple of stillness around him, the respect, the discomfort, the awareness. He wasn't just a man in a suit anymore. He had become a mirror. Farther back in business class, Calvin Rhodes was reviewing his earlier voice memo, not because he doubted what he heard, but because he wanted to be sure every word was preserved accurately. If the company tried to spin this, he'd be ready. But the truth was, he hoped they wouldn't. He hoped Isaiah's example would be enough. In the front galley, Olivia Tran stood near the service counter, quietly speaking with one of the replacement attendants. She kept checking the curtain behind her, not out of fear, but to make sure no one erased the moment too soon. She thought about the many times she had seen things go unnoticed. A stare, a slow dismissal, a traveler skipped in line, a black teenager asked twice for ID while a white man walked through without a glance. She thought about the time she stayed quiet, and she promised herself, never again. In 1A, Isaiah reached down to unzip his briefcase and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It wasn't corporate paperwork. It wasn't a boarding pass. It was a letter, one he had kept with him for years. The envelope was creased, slightly faded. On the front, in small, careful script, it read, "Isaiah." He opened it slowly, like someone handling something sacred. Mariah's handwriting flowed across the page. Soft curves, firm lines. She had written it the night she left. "Isaiah, I believe in what you're building. I really do. But I miss the man you were before it. The man who made pancakes on Sundays. The man who used to dance with our daughter in the kitchen. You're fighting so hard for a seat at someone else's table, you forgot how to sit at your own. If you ever find your way back, we'll be here. But I can't wait for you in silence. Love always. Moon." He had read it 100 times. And still, it broke something every time. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true. He had spent so long trying to rise, trying to prove he belonged, trying to outwork judgment that he forgot the difference between showing up and showing through. And now, here he was, sitting in 1A, still carrying the cost. He folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the napkin Helena had given him. 2 reminders, one from the past, one from the present, both asking the same question. What kind of legacy are you really leaving? He sat up straighter. If he had anything to say about it, it wouldn't be one built on titles. It would be built on truth. The kind that corrects not just policy, but people. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the cabin shifted slightly as flight attendants began preparing for service. Conversations resumed, though still soft. The man in 2C glanced over and gave Isaiah a respectful nod. No words, just acknowledgement. And Isaiah nodded back. Not with pride, with purpose. Because leadership wasn't about always being seen. Sometimes it was about standing still long enough for others to see themselves more clearly. The cabin lights glowed low, casting soft halos above each row. Outside, the sky stretched in velvet silence as Orion Airways flight OA709 cruised above the Atlantic. Trays had been cleared, drinks served, and the passengers had settled into a half-sleep rhythm. But Isaiah Cole remained wide awake. He sat in 1A, posture straight, hands resting on the folded tray table. The napkin from Helena still lay within reach, beside the letter from Mariah. And now, between them, a blank sheet of company stationery. His pen hovered above it, then moved. Not fast, not for show, with precision. The first line he wrote wasn't a title. It was a promise. Every passenger, regardless of appearance or perceived status, shall be treated with equal dignity, from boarding to landing. He paused, took a breath, then continued. He had drafted a dozen policy updates in his career. Most were filled with corporate language compliance metrics, training benchmarks, procedural resets, but this one wasn't about numbers. This one was about people. He titled it Passenger Dignity Initiative Executive Memo Proposal. Underneath, he began outlining a plan. Not vague ideas, specific measures, live bias training, real-world scenario simulations, a whistleblower channel with full anonymity, mandatory reporting of crew-led seating reassignments, cross-audit checks tied to internal passenger codes, and one final clause. Any discriminatory action taken by flight personnel, intentional or otherwise, will result in immediate review, up to and including suspension pending investigation. Bias is not a risk. It is a violation. He stopped writing and looked out the window. The clouds below looked like frozen waves. Silent. Still. This wasn't just a document. This was his line in the sky. Across the aisle, Helena Moore stirred lightly in her seat, eyes fluttering open. She saw Isaiah still writing, brow furrowed, back upright, pen moving with care. She whispered softly, "You're not done." "Are you?" Isaiah looked up, met her gaze. "Not even close," he said. A few rows back, Calvin Rhodes opened a secure email from the PR team. "We've received Isaiah's name confirmed. Situation is now under internal executive review. You were right to flag it. Do you believe this will go public?" Calvin stared at the message for a moment, then typed slowly. "Not if they handle it right, but if they try to spin it, he's not the one who'll raise his voice. The public will." He hit send. In the front galley, Olivia Tran leaned against the counter, sipping lukewarm tea. Her shift was steady now, no turbulence, but her mind still stirred. She had stood by too many times, had watched passengers of color get double-checked while others slid past, had watched a black teenager get questioned over his backpack size while a white businessman boarded with a full-sized roller and no challenge. And every time, she told herself it wasn't her job to interfere. Tonight changed that. Tonight reminded her that silence could be complicity if it came after knowing better. From the cockpit, Captain Langley stepped out once more. He walked the aisle slowly, not as a leader patrolling, but as a man taking stock. When he reached Isaiah's seat, he spoke quietly. "How's everything, sir?" Isaiah looked up from his draft. "Better now, but not fixed." Langley nodded, then tilted his head toward the folded page. Company policy. Isaiah handed him the sheet. Langley scanned the lines, eyebrows lifting slightly at the clarity. Then he paused on the final clause. This is going to shake a few walls, he said. It's supposed to, Isaiah replied. Langley folded the page and slipped it gently into his flight manual folder. I'll make sure this lands where it needs to. Make sure it lands where it can't be ignored, Isaiah said. Langley nodded again. Copy that. As he turned to walk away, Isaiah added, And Captain, Langley stopped. Thank you for not brushing this off. Langley gave a half smile, almost apologetic. Sometimes leadership looks like stepping forward. Tonight, it looked like stepping back and letting you speak. Isaiah let that sit for a moment, then nodded. Either way, it was seen. Langley returned to the cockpit. Isaiah turned back to his briefcase and carefully refolded the draft memo. He placed it back inside, alongside the letter from Mariah and the napkin from Helena. Different sources. Same message. Change isn't a press release. It's a promise you keep after the plane lands. The hum of the engines continued. The air in the cabin had lightened. Not fully, but meaningfully. A few passengers walked the aisle. Some offered Isaiah small nods, the kind reserved for those who had carried something heavy without asking for applause. In 2B, Helena leaned toward Isaiah. You think they'll actually implement it? He thought for a moment, then answered with clarity. If they don't, I will. She smiled. What do you call that? He looked at her. Accountability. She smiled again, softer this time. I call it leadership. Isaiah looked away, not out of pride, but a focus on something larger than himself. He didn't need validation. He needed change. And he was going to make sure it happened, even if he had to draft it by hand, one flight at a time. The cabin had settled into that strange rhythm of long-haul flights. Dimmed lights, quiet screens flickering in the dark. A few muffled conversations between people who'd never spoken before today, but now shared something unspoken. Isaiah Cole sat in 1A, still awake. Posture calm, but alert. He wasn't tired. He had passed tired hours ago. Now he was somewhere else entirely. That space leaders know too well where rest is replaced by responsibility, and peace comes not from sleep, but from progress. He opened his phone and began typing a draft email. It was addressed to the Orion Executive Ethics Council, a body he'd helped design years ago, ironically, to protect passengers like him. He wrote the subject line first. Regarding incident on Flight OA709, Executive Summary and Action Items. He stared at the blinking cursor for a second, then began typing. Attached is an informal memo prepared on board Flight OA709 regarding a first-hand incident of passenger discrimination and protocol failure by senior flight crew. This email serves as notice of immediate policy review, pending formal investigation upon landing. He was still typing when he noticed movement 2 rows back. A man in a navy pullover, mid-50s, salt and pepper beard, stood and began walking forward. Isaiah recognized him. He wasn't just any passenger. That was Edward Linwood, Senior Vice President of Global Passenger Experience for Orion Airways. Isaiah remembered approving his last bonus package. Edward approached slowly, hesitantly. When he reached Isaiah's row, he didn't speak right away. He simply stood there. Isaiah looked up. "Evening, Edward," he said quietly. Edward gave a faint, awkward smile. "Mr. Cole," he nodded. "Didn't expect to see you here. Not under these circumstances." Isaiah set his phone down gently. "You were here the whole time." Edward's mouth twitched. I was. I didn't think it was my place to intervene. I figured it would play itself out. Isaiah didn't flinch. That's the problem, isn't it? You hoped silence would solve it? Edward swallowed. I didn't want to overstep. Isaiah's voice stayed even, but the words cut sharper now. You didn't want to be uncomfortable. The silence hung between them. A full executive, a full human, and a man who had chosen comfort over courage. I read the memo, Edward said, shifting his weight. It's strong. It's necessary. I agree, and I want to support its implementation. Isaiah raised an eyebrow. Support it, or save face because you were seen doing nothing. Edward looked away. I suppose, both. Isaiah didn't soften. Then own that. Edward nodded slowly. I will. I should have stood up. You still can, Isaiah said, but not with words, with decisions. A beat passed. Then Edward took the seat across the aisle 1B where Helena had stepped away to use the lavatory. He turned his phone on and began typing. This time, not an excuse. A statement. Passenger Experience Division formally endorses the Cole memo. Pre-clearance requested for immediate rollout post-debrief. Recommend public-facing action within 48 hours. He looked back up at Isaiah. It's not enough, he said, but it's a start. Isaiah nodded, not with praise, with acknowledgement. I don't need it to be perfect. I need it to be real. In the aisle behind them, Calvin Rhodes had been watching. He'd seen Edward approach, heard every word. His phone recorded none of it. His memory recorded all of it. He smiled to himself. Maybe this wouldn't just be a viral moment. Maybe it could be a movement. A few minutes later, Helena returned and took her seat. She noticed Edward next to her, nodding slightly, then looked toward Isaiah with raised brows. He gave her a small smile, just enough. Service resumed quietly. Drinks were refreshed. A few passengers asked for coffee. Others closed their eyes to rest. But something had shifted. The quiet on the plane no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like listening. Isaiah turned back to his phone and finished the email. He attached the memo, added the timestamp, then one final sentence. What happened tonight wasn't an exception. It was a mirror. It's time we decide whether we'll keep looking away or fix what we see. He hit send, and just like that, the message left the aircraft, faster than the jet engines, louder than the silence, more powerful than any press conference. Isaiah leaned back, let out a quiet breath, and looked out the window. The stars stretched across the sky like small truths undeniable, even when ignored. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was trying to be a man who left things better than he found them. And tonight, maybe he had. The captain's voice crackled gently over the cabin speakers, breaking the soft rhythm of the cruising flight. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our initial descent into Washington Dulles shortly. Please return to your seats, fasten your seatbelts, and ensure all tray tables are in their upright position. Local time is 5:42 a.m. A slow rustle of movement spread across the cabin. Blankets were folded, phones turned off airplane mode, eyelids opened one by one. But Isaiah Cole had not slept. He didn't need to. He had written what needed to be written, said what needed to be said. And now, the truth would land with the plane. He folded his coat over his arm and sat calmly, watching the clouds shift outside the window as the aircraft lowered altitude. Morning light began to creep in from the east, soft and silvery, like the kind that follows a storm. He glanced across the aisle. Helena Moore had been typing for the last half hour. Her story draft. She was finishing the final lines now. He didn't know the headline she'd choose, but he knew what mattered more, the part no one could ignore. Not anymore. Behind them. Edward Linwood adjusted his collar, reviewing the email thread that had started blowing up the minute Isaiah hit send. An emergency response team had already scheduled a virtual executive meeting for 9 a.m. sharp. The term incident had been upgraded to critical breach. Legal was reviewing footage, and public relations was on standby with 3 separate versions of a statement, depending on what direction Isaiah took this. Edward scrolled down and reread the phrase Isaiah had ended with. "It's time we decide whether we'll keep looking away or fix what we see." It hit harder than any boardroom speech ever had. In the galley. Olivia Tran straightened her uniform and quietly briefed the new flight attendants. She had been in the sky long enough to know when something bigger than the plane was in motion. And this was bigger than any reroute or delay she had ever faced. It was a shift in culture, a shift that started in seat 1A. Isaiah heard the landing gear engage with a soft hum. He felt the weight of descent, not just of the aircraft, but of attention. He could sense what was waiting at the gate. News cameras, internal investigators, a social current moving just beneath the surface. He didn't want it, but he was ready. As the plane banked left over Virginia, sunlight spilled into the cabin, catching the side of his face. It warmed his cheek, and for the first time since takeoff, he allowed himself a breath that went all the way in. He thought of his daughter, Jaya, 17, bright, fierce, the kind of kid who asked hard questions at the dinner table and didn't back down. She had once asked him, "How many times do you have to remind the world you belong in the room?" He hadn't known how to answer then. Now, maybe he did. As many times as it takes until the door doesn't close behind you. The landing was smooth, a gentle touchdown, the tires brushing the tarmac with the whisper of impact. A few passengers clapped softly. Most remained quiet. They weren't thinking about the flight. They were thinking about what came after. The taxi to the gate felt longer than usual, not because of time, but anticipation. People glanced out the windows. Some checked their phones. A few refreshed news apps already catching wind of the story. Isaiah didn't move, not until the aircraft stopped. When the seatbelt sign dinged off, the cabin came alive again, but no one rushed the aisle. Instead, they stood and turned subtly, respectfully toward the front, toward Isaiah, toward the man who had changed something quietly and completely. Helena was first. She stood beside him, met his eyes, and said, "You didn't just speak for yourself." Isaiah gave a half smile. "Didn't feel like I had a choice." "You did," she replied. "You just chose the right one." Edward stepped forward next, briefcase in hand. He extended it like a peace offering. "I'll deliver the policy packet in person. With my name on it this time." Isaiah nodded. "Do it for the system," he said. "Not for me." Outside the window, a small crowd had gathered. Uniformed agents, airline executives, a few media crews with badges. Flashbulbs waiting, Isaiah stood, adjusted his jacket, and looked around the cabin one last time. To the man in 3C who had once looked away. To the woman in 2D who had silently wept behind sunglasses. To the teenager scrolling on his phone with new eyes. They all saw him now, not as a headline, as a mirror. He turned to Olivia, who stood near the door, arms crossed, quiet strength in her posture. "You made a choice, too," he said. "I made the right one," she replied. They didn't need to say goodbye. They had already said enough. As Isaiah stepped into the jet bridge, The flash of cameras began. Voices called his name. Someone shouted for a statement. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lift his chin. He walked slowly, like he always had. With clarity, with weight, with the calm strength of someone who had nothing to prove but everything to protect. And behind him, a cabin full of witnesses watched the man they had once tried to move. Now, the whole world was following him. The air in the terminal was thick with anticipation. The crowd at the gate parted as Isaiah Cole stepped out from the jet bridge. Flashes from news cameras flickering off every polished surface. Reporters angled for the best shot. Travelers paused mid-stride, catching the story in real time, whispering to each other as they realized who he was. Isaiah didn't rush. He walked with steady composure through the knot of people, acknowledging no one in particular, but seeing everyone. Security made a path, but he never looked over his shoulder. He wasn't hiding. Not today. Not anymore. He could hear someone calling his name. He could feel the tension and the questions pressed toward him. Mr. Cole, do you have a comment about what happened on board? Will you press charges against the crew? Are you going to sue Orion Airways? He paused, not for effect, but for breath, for truth. He turned toward the cameras. Look not into the lens, but just beyond it, as if speaking directly to someone listening at home. I'm not here for vengeance, he said. Voice even. I'm here for change. What happened to me isn't unique. That's why it matters. Dignity should not depend on a name tag or a seat assignment or the color of your skin. It should be the baseline for every person who steps onto a plane. For every person, period. He let that sit, nodded once, and continued through the crowd. In the background, Edward Linwood, now with sleeves rolled up, hurried to the corporate office with the policy draft. He handed it off personally to the CEO and the Ethics Council, each signature added beneath Isaiah's original, within hours. Orion Airways released a statement, not crafted by the PR team, but by executive order. It read, in part, effective immediately. Orion Airways will implement the Passenger Dignity Initiative, as drafted by Mr. Isaiah Cole, Chief Operating Officer, North America. All current and future crew members will participate in mandatory live bias training, and any verified case of discrimination will result in immediate review and corrective action. News outlets picked it up within minutes. By noon, the hashtags rightful seat and dignity in the air were trending on every social platform. Passengers around the world began sharing their own stories. Some were small slights, a look, a question, a second check. Others were larger wounds. But all found a place in the open, no longer hidden in the shadows of policy. Helena Moore's story, published online before noon, went viral. The headline read, "One seat, one voice. How Isaiah Cole changed the skies for all of us." In the article, she described every moment Isaiah's calm, the silence that followed, and the wave of honesty that finally broke through. Within Orion's headquarters, the company's board convened for an emergency session. Vanessa Crane and Carter Blake were officially terminated, with a public statement of regret for their actions. Olivia Tran, who spoke up, was commended and promoted to head of training for the new initiative. Calvin Rhodes received a thank you from corporate for his quiet vigilance, but he shrugged it off, telling his friends, "It's not about credit, it's about the next flight." Captain Marcus Langley was named to the Internal Compliance Committee. His calm, procedural honesty, now seen as the gold standard for leadership. Isaiah, meanwhile, found a quiet spot in the terminal, away from the cameras and the noise. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a familiar name, Jaya Cole. He called. She answered on the first ring. "Hey, Dad," she said, voice full of sleep but curiosity. "Hey, Jaya. We landed safe. It's been a long night." She yawned. "I saw your name on the news already. Are you okay?" He laughed softly. "I'm good. Tired. But I think things might actually change this time." There was a pause. Then, "I'm proud of you." He closed his eyes for a moment, letting it in. "Thank you. Kiddo? Are you coming home soon?" she asked. He smiled. "As soon as I can. After the call." Isaiah sat and watched the people flow by, the families, the business travelers, the students, the elders. He watched a young black woman board with her mother, both in bright dresses, both walking straight to the premium boarding lane. He saw a flight attendant smile and check their tickets. No hesitation, no second guess. That, he thought, is what it's supposed to look like. The final press conference was held the next day. Isaiah stood beside the CEO and the Ethics Council, answering questions not about lawsuits, but about policy, about justice, about the future. He spoke quietly, clearly, about accountability, about showing up for others, about the power of small decisions. He ended with a single sentence. The goal isn't just to fly higher, it's to make sure everyone lands with their dignity intact. When the event ended, Isaiah received a simple handwritten note from the CEO. "Thank you for reminding us what leadership looks like." He tucked it into his briefcase, alongside Mariah's letter and Helena's napkin. Legacy, he realized, isn't about the seat you claim for yourself. It's about the space you make for others. On his next flight, Isaiah boarded without a second glance. No side eyes, no whispered doubts. He took his seat, any seat, with the confidence not just of a man who belonged, but of a man who had changed the rules for everyone who ever would. The aircraft lifted through the clouds, and Isaiah looked out, seeing his own reflection in the glass. He saw not just himself, but everyone who had ever been told to move to the back, everyone who had waited for permission, everyone who had finally stood up, quietly, powerfully, and said, "I belong here." And somewhere, at 30,000 feet, a different kind of freedom settled into the sky. Isaiah's journey reminds us that every seat, every story, and every person carries worth that cannot be decided by someone else's bias. In a world where quiet injustice often hides behind polite procedure, it only takes one person to stand their ground, and suddenly, silence gives way to truth. Let this story be a mirror and a promise, a mirror for us to see the ways we can do better, and a promise that dignity must never be negotiable. Maybe today it happened to Isaiah, but tomorrow it could happen to you, to your family, to someone you love. Together, we have the power to challenge what's wrong, to uplift what's right, and to make the skies in our world a place where everyone truly belongs. If this story moved you, show your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Let's make sure no one ever has to fight for their place alone again. Thank you for watching, for feeling, and for being a part of this journey. Stay tuned for more powerful stories that demand to be heard right here on our channel.